As Planet Zoo 2 is likely a year away, possibly releasing in November next year to sort of keep with the pattern of Frontier's game releases, then this small window may mean some animals from the roster might be cut. By the end of Planet Zoo 1 we had 210 animals, but given the time frame, I'm expecting a few species to be cut. Now, there are several species that can be considered safe as they are either so iconic or so common in captivity that it would not make a lot of sense to omit them from the roster. Then there's species that have many unique aspects that would add some much needed biodiversity in the roster. And also species that would be added to diversify regions that would otherwise lack representation. I'm also not counting subspecies in this, so I've combined any animals that are like multiple subspecies of the same species into a whole species. So those would be animals like your Asian elephant, your brown bear, grey wolf, leopard and tiger. All those are going to be combined into their own full species. And yeah, I'm also going to go through animals that I think would be cut, and I would like to apologize in advance if I cut one of your favorite species, but for each of them I will have my reasons, and a few of them will hurt for me personally, as some of them are well, a couple of my favorite animals, but they're either not that common in captivity or are non-existent in captivity. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So we'll start with animals that I'd say are guaranteed picks, that no matter what happens, they will be in the game as they are simply too iconic to get rid of. These being the lion, the African bush elephant, the tiger, the white rhino, common hippopotamus, western lowland gorilla, chimpanzee, wolf, brown bear, red panda, giant panda, Asian elephant, American bison, leopard, dromedary camel, Bornean orangutan, ring-tailed lemur, red kangaroo, koala, cheetah, meerkat, spotted hyena, California sea lion, American alligator, capybara, common ostrich, Asian small-clawed otter, common warthog, Komodo dragon, plains zebra, polar bear, American flamingo, reticulated giraffe, saltwater crocodile and the snow leopard. All these animals I just can't imagine a zoo game without, because especially with the current state of Planet Zoo, these are some of the most iconic animals on the planet, and iconic in zoos as well, particularly animals like your Asian small-clawed otter and capybara, both of which are very common in captivity. American flamingo as well I have picked over the greater flamingo in this section, simply because it is the better of the two to have in a zoo, and it also has a more vibrant pink coloration that I think of people would expect from a flamingo, and so I think it is just the go-to for flamingos for the game, though I do have greater flamingo a little bit later, as it is a very common species in captivity. Other animals like American alligators, you often see them more often than crocodiles. Spotted hyenas, well known from The Lion King. Bison are a staple of conservation. Dromedary camel I'd say is more iconic than the Bactrian, simply because you see it more often, and it is sort of the definitive camel in most people's eyes, because it is the one that most people meet and are most familiar with. Now I've got both species of elephant here, as both are fairly interchangeable in how iconic they are, but simply they are both very iconic animals, and so make sense to have in the base game. And so this brings us to a total number of 35 of iconic species. Next we will go on to species that are fairly common in captivity, species that are both very common in captivity but also species that are often viewed in some of the more popular zoos around the world. Basically, this list includes animals that are on a majority of zoo collection lists that I've viewed in some of my research. Species I classify in this area would be animals like the red-necked wallaby, the emu, the black buck, red deer, scimitar-horned oryx, Indian peafowl, moot swan, giant anteater, bongo, binturong, black and white ruffed lemur, the black rhinoceros, the Baird's tapir, the African penguin, the addax, the African crested porcupine, aardvark, African buffalo, African wild dog, spurred tortoise, Aldabra giant tortoise, blue wildebeest, black-tailed prairie dog, fennec fox, caracal, pygmy hippopotamus, hamadryas baboon, red river hog, Pierre David's deer, Przewalski's horse, nilgai, ocelot, maned wolf, siamang, lar gibbon, jaguar, Indian rhinoceros, king penguin, reindeer, great rhea, European fallow deer, Cuvier's dwarf caiman, nine-banded armadillo, raccoon, cougar, collared peccary, bush dog, southern cassowary, boa constrictor, Gila monster, green iguana, red-eyed tree frog, golden poison frog, axolotl, Mexican red-knee tarantula, giant forest scorpion, Menelaus blue morpho, monarch butterfly, western diamondback rattlesnake, the Asian water monitor, the alpaca, goat, donkey, cattle, chicken, sheep, pig, and llama, all domestic species that are fairly common in zoo collections, the Egyptian fruit bat, the Hermann's tortoise, Bactrian camel, Thompson's gazelle, red-crowned crane, Galapagos giant tortoise, and the greater flamingo. All these species are on a multitude of different lists, or at least species that are fairly close to them as well, and I feel like just a zoo roster needs the variety, and particularly for these last two, the Galapagos tortoise and greater flamingo, I was initially going to omit them actually, but I feel like giving players the choice of which one you want, and the greater flamingo is an African species, whereas the American flamingo is of course from the Americas. So having the choice to be able to have a flamingo for different sections of your zoo, I think is really great power to the player, and the giant tortoises as well are fairly interchangeable and can often be housed together. But the Galapagos I feel is fairly iconic, but also the Aldabra is a staple of zoos across the planet really. Like you find more Aldabra in zoos than Galapagos, and so I feel like having both of them here is really important. Lastly, onto species that would add diversity, and are sort of the species you can see in many popular zoos around the world for a majority of them. So we have the Tasmanian devil, Cockerel sifaka, moose, North American beaver, Arctic fox, Kirk's diptych, clouded leopard, grey seal, bighorn sheep, North Sulawesi babirusa, common wombat, Dharma gazelle, okapi, fusa, Eurasian lynx, gharial, giant otter, giant leaf insect, honey badger, Japanese macaque, Japanese raccoon dog, mandrill, Chinese pangolin, bonobo, Malayan tapir, sun bear, markhor, lion-tailed macaque, white-faced saki, wolverine, nyala, North Island brown kiwi, Pallas's cat, pronghorn antelope, red-ruffed lemur, sloth bear, spectacled caiman, tarkin, striped hyena, licence, sandcat, little penguin, Colombian white-faced capuchin monkey, diamondback terrapin, Malabar rose, European peacock, cloudless sulphur, old world swallowtail, and the brown-throated sloth. All these species would be really great to get back, and this brings us to a total of 160 with the added species from the previous slide, which I forgot to mention. So I think that's a pretty nice starting number out of all the animals, but it of course could be lower, and this is a selection of animals that can easily be traded out if extra space is needed. And from the start, if we were to start with 160, we would have dropped by 50 species. However, those species that have been dropped can either have more diverse replacements in the base game, in my opinion, as well as also trade their slots for various new exhibit, aquarium, and aviary species for the new game. I would, however, like to go over a couple of categories for some of the emissions from this list, and yeah, some of them are also animals that aren't really common in zoos, and so yeah, there could be some painful emissions. So my first category would be the animals that are more so seen as wild animals, like basically species that aren't generally seen in zoos due to their prevalence in areas that may be close to a zoo's location, or are just very commonplace out in the wild, or even in urban areas. I do believe that all cut species would be added back in some way later on in Planet Zoo 2's lifespan, and 160 is of course not a definitive number. But let's get into some of these animals. The first of which being the coyote, a species that, though is found in many zoos, is not really what I'd consider as a zoo animal, as in many zoos in the US, coyotes can just enter the zoo grounds voluntarily. The next is the red fox, a beautiful animal but really not common in a lot of zoos simply because it is so prevalent in the wild and in urban areas all over the world where they're not considered for zoos as they are so prevalent. Then we have the striped skunk, a cool member of the mustelid family that has been doing very well alongside humans, but in the game it also doesn't really do too much, with the majority of the other animals in the game having a lot more behaviours that could be considered more unique. Another mustelid here is the European badger, which is beloved around the world and has some striking coloration, but isn't too common in zoos in many parts of the world as they are very common in the wild across Europe. But in many countries such as the US are replaced with their own native American badger, and around the world can often be substituted for the notorious honey badger. And as we have the latter in the game and in this roster, the European badger doesn't have too much that it offers in comparison, as the honey badger also has a few more unique animations. The last species in this category is the wild boar. Like the red fox, is a very successful animal found very prevalently within both its native range and invasive range, and so is not often housed in captivity as they are so common in the wild, in which they will often be substituted for domestic pigs and other wild swines like the babirusa, warthog and red river hog in many zoos. The next category is animals that have substitutes that are more common in captivity or fill a similar niche to an animal already part of my selected roster. The first species being the gemsbok, a beautiful antelope but is very similar to the scimitar horned oryx in terms of how it would be used in an exhibit, and has often led to the species being exchanged for the more endangered scimitar horned oryx, which already fills the same purpose. And you also don't tend to find gemsbok in captivity too often, as I know only a select few zoos have them, relative to the scimitar horned oryx. Next is the Dall sheep, a cool animal on its own, but is simply not as common and in some ways harder to house than the much more adaptable and popular bighorn sheep, and so isn't really necessary for the base game, as both serve the same purpose, and Dall sheep was often being used as a placeholder until the bighorn sheep was added to Planet Zoo. A species that not everyone might agree on with being cut is the Nile monitor. It has been heavily used since launch, but I feel it has been replaced by the much more versatile and more high quality Asian water monitor from the tropical pack, which is able to do one thing that the Nile monitor can't, which is deep dive. But I think the Asian water monitor is also just a more popular substitute in real life, as I've heard of there being more Asian water monitors in captivity than the Nile. So that's, I feel, having the Asian water monitor already, I feel would not really make the Nile monitor necessary for the base. Another animal that is serving a similar purpose to others, namely the more unique sloth bear and sun bear, is the Asiatic black bear. Though fairly widespread in zoos worldwide, it isn't a species that I feel is a base game necessity, as it is largely the same colour and also filling a similar purpose to the aforementioned sloth and sun bears, both of which have fairly unique attributes that make them more attractive to players for zoo projects, and being more unique species overall. The black wildebeest is largely overshadowed by the blue wildebeest, both in the game and in real life. In game, the blue wildebeest is a much more high quality model, and in life, blues tend to be used a lot more often, as there are species that coexist very well with many species, like giraffes, zebras, ostriches, rhinos and more. This just makes them a much better investment in interspecies habitats, and are also more recognisable and more widespread than the black wildebeest, being found across sub-Saharan Africa, and so are able to cohabitate with a wider range of species. As cool as the alpine ibex is, it isn't an animal seen in captivity too often, and is largely replaced by the more spectacular markhor, and even by another species of ibex, the Nubian ibex of the Arabian Peninsula. But the alpine ibex and markhor, despite being from different parts of the world and looking fairly different, they fill the same role, and so the ibex can probably be saved for a future reintroduction into the roster. The third category contains 3 species, with none or almost no existing captive representation that I can find, those being the Goliath frog and Titan beetle. The frog has been housed in captivity before, so it could potentially be added later. But as Titan beetles have never been successfully kept in captivity before, at least based on my research, then they are just taking up a slot from another species that would be more worthwhile. Like another species of beetle like the Hercules beetle, which I know is very prominent in zoos. But it really is just, it was just added as it is the record holder for the largest beetle in the world, but without captive representation it's not really a zoo animal. And this fact also extends to a habitat animal, the saiga, that despite it being a very cool animal, it isn't a species that is both heavily used in game, but also an animal that has an extremely limited presence in captivity, with them either being off display or just in a very large enclosure out of sight, as the species runs a very long way from perceived danger and has led them to being a pretty poor animal to be kept in paddock life, as when they run they often collide with the fence or the wall and can get seriously injured or die. And so they're not made for the captive life, like other hoofstock are, that will tend to walk away rather than bolt. But saiga are just not that way, and has led them to being a creature that only a zoo in Kazakhstan and in Russia that I've found display the animal to my knowledge. And so I feel we can afford to cut it, as it really isn't designed for a zoo environment as a species. Now we're going to finish the animals that are being cut with both extremely rare to non-existent in captivity and species that some would say could be gap fillers in the roster. Now brace yourself, because a few of these may hurt. So we'll start with Asia. Now, proboscis monkeys are very rare in captivity, only being found in one zoo nowadays outside their native range of Borneo, that being the Singapore Zoo. But they're a species that not a lot of people would get the opportunity to see, and I feel aren't a necessity for the base game of Planet Zoo 2, as they're really not an animal often associated with zoos. The second one would be the dhole. Now, I personally love these wild dogs. They're very unique and have a lot of cool things that they do. They are, however, not a common sight in zoos around the world, being often substituted for more popular canines, being found in only a select few institutions outside of Asia, like the Bronx Zoo in the US or the Dublin Zoo in Ireland. And I wanted to try and reduce the number of canids present in the base game as well, so that more new species can be considered instead. But this one does hurt a bit for me, as they are probably my second favourite wild dog after the African wild dog. And up there with maned wolves and bush dogs. But yeah, I just think it could be added back later. Then we have the wild water buffalo. Now, water buffalo as a term is very common in captivity. However, they are of a different species, the domestic water buffalo, which is Bubalus bubalus, which is housed in captivity around the world. The wild water buffalo, Bubalus arni, on the other hand, only has one example of captive presence that I could find, and that's at the Kathmandu Zoo in Nepal, where there is a herd. And with this species being so rare in zoos, it isn't really a necessary inclusion in my opinion, as we do have the African buffalo already, which fills a similar niche, as the Cape buffalo in particular can be found in wetland habitats and tends to like the water quite a lot, and same with forest buffalo, which are the same species, and if my variant system were to be considered, they could make it into Planet Zoo 2. But this species should definitely return later on, as it has educated players on both this species' existence and its endangered status. Moving on to Australia, we have a couple that are both species not found in captivity, often outside of the country, but even species that are only found in zoos in the country. The first two, hurt for me the most, as they are animals that I have had some pretty cool experiences with in real life. But simply put, that the quokka, to my knowledge, is only found at the Wilhelma Zoological Garden in Germany outside of Australia. Otherwise, nowhere else. They're very cool animals. I feel like it's an animal that could be a later inclusion in the base in the roster. The dingo is well known, a very well known animal, but doesn't share a lot of characteristics with many other canines, particularly with wolves, and are often considered synonymous with the grey wolf species. And though being smaller, there isn't a lot to them that differentiates them from the wolf other than their appearance. But dingoes are found in a couple of zoos outside of Australia, but not many, and so aren't an animal that I feel is necessary for the game, or at least the base game. The Australian exhibit animals come up next. So the notorious eastern brown snake is not often housed in captivity outside of Australia, and even in Australia, really only kept in herpetological facilities for research and venom extraction for the anti-venom program. The giant burrowing cockroach is exactly what the name says it is, but are really only captive here in Australia and maybe some entomologists around the world. The spectacled flying fox is a beautiful species of megabat from the far north of Australia and extending into Papua New Guinea and some of the surrounding islands. But here in Australia, they're not even a common species in zoos, largely being at rescue centres, rather than permanent residents at most parks. The common blue-tongued skink is probably, I'd say, the third most popular lizard in Australia after frilled lizards and bearded dragons, as it does of course have that distinct purplish blue tongue. But I feel like if we're going to potentially expand the exhibit roster to include several highly requested and popular species, then making space for some of those more popular and unique lizards like basilisks, caiman lizards, geckos, frilled lizards, and more could be helped by temporarily dropping the blue tongue from the roster. Then the last exhibit animal we have is the common death adder. Now death adders are really cool snakes, but they don't look at all like how the game portrays them, but are also not a very common sight out of Australian herpetological collections. Otherwise they'd probably be limited to venomous snake collections outside the country, but they're not always going to be in a zoo setting. And it is another reptile that I feel like could temporarily be exchanged for some more popular elapids like the cobras, king cobras, mambas or taipans. However, the biggest emission from this continent is the platypus. Now, I can already hear the pitchforks in the street. Despite being an incredibly unique animal, one of 3 different kinds of monotreme, it is not very common in zoos outside of Australia, being only found at the San Diego Zoo Safari Park in the United States, and even here in Australia only a select few institutions house the animal in a zoo setting. But if it is cut, I would certainly expect it to return down the line, but yeah, this is probably one of the biggest omissions out of the lot, but given its lack of a prominent presence in zoos, I'd say it's not a necessity for the base game and can be added back later. But yeah, this one is probably the most unique omission of the lot. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on the platypus being omitted. Now on to Africa, which has 9 species which I feel can be cut and saved for future updates. Now many of them are pretty unique in their own rights, but I feel like aren't really animals that need to be in the base game. These being the desert horned viper, the giant tiger land snail, which despite being our only gastropod, I do not find myself using quite a lot. The Goliath beetle, the Nile lechwe, the puff adder, which is very notorious but not common in a lot of zoos, the sable antelope, the sacred scarab beetle, the Somali wild ass, and the springbok. Now, all are very great. Like, I am not saying that I dislike these species whatsoever, they are all very cool. But many of them are either not too popular or heavily used, or have better alternatives, or just don't stand out enough to take slots up from new species that could be added. But I can definitely see a lot of these animals returning later on. Onto the Americas, we have the giant desert hairy scorpion, the Brazilian salmon pig tarantula, American bullfrog, lesser Antillean iguana, Amazonian giant centipede, Brazilian wandering spider, Goliath bird-eating spider, layman's poison frog, and the yellow anaconda. All of which contribute diversity to the exhibit roster, but many aren't found in zoos as often as possible alternatives, and so can be saved for later in Planet Zoo 2, but these cuts would also create more space for new species. Though I will say, it's a bit of a sting to cut the Goliath bird eater, as it is a really impressive animal in life, but it would of course return later on due to its iconic nature. And finally we have Europe, which has 2, the fire salamander and the Danube crested newt, both of which are cool amphibians in their own right, but aren't as frequently viewed in captivity as other newts and salamanders like the axolotl from earlier. but are certainly iconic species in their own rights and in the regions that they're found, but I feel like could be added back a little bit later, so to free up space in the roster. Now, these cuts of course are not guaranteed, and Frontier can throw curveballs at us, but I don't think the roster would face a drastic number of cuts, or at least as drastic a number of cuts as Jurassic World Evolution 3 did, as particularly remasters for many of the particularly base game and first 2 years of DLC species would be the only ones to receive remasters, with a couple of species from beyond there receiving a few tweaks here and there. But a majority of the roster wouldn't receive many model changes, and so many of the animals can come over to Planet Zoo 2 in their current state, with just a few edits to their models and maybe some additional behaviours that I mentioned in a previous video. As that is where I think a majority of the animal work should be for the species from the first game to go, is more behaviours than model changes, as we still want a good diversity of aviary and aquarium species, and even some new exhibit species to complement these new systems, if they are in the sequel, that is. But yeah, that's all for this video. Let me know what you think. I know a lot of these cuts they hurt, but I feel like given that they only have a year at most, there could be some pretty significant cuts, and so you just have to prepare yourselves for possible exclusions from the base roster. But yeah, like a lot of these animals, at least a lot of the best animals, I feel, will be in the base game, because yeah, a lot of them are very common in captivity, and so you're still going to be able to make pretty sizable zoos with the roster. And with added aviary species and possibly aquarium species and new exhibit animals, I think we're in for a real treat with Planet Zoo 2. And so yeah, yeah, this was a hard video to make because I had to pick the animals. But yeah, let me know what animals you would cut in the comments down below if it was in your hands. But yeah, that is all for this video, and I will see you in the next one.